Why don't you go ahead and tell us about Davy Crockett?
All right. So, my honors thesis is entitled A Superlicious Feast, Davy Crockett's Almanacks as Cultural Hegemony and Justification for American Imperialism. All right. Folklore. It's a word that invokes romantic imagery of heroes and villains locked in a battle of good and evil. We have our own national folk heroes here in America, few more widely known or more misunderstood than Davy Crockett. Next slide. According to folklorist Richard Dorson, the best existent folklore of Crockett finds its form in a set of comic almanacs printed between 1835 and 1856. He has written that, quote, "My view is that they were indeed the cherished popular folk heroes of the young American nation." While Dorson took these works as faithfully collected folk stories, modern scholarship now almost universally follows the opinion of Professor of English John Seeley, who has written that, quote, "The earliest Crockett almanacs were the products of commercial considerations, produced in New England and have been created in New England, divorced from any direct contact with the trans-Allegheny zone." But if these almanacs were not folklore, then what were they? And what was their function? Next slide. In the opinion of folklorist Stephen Gencarella, a better understanding of this question could be gained by employing a rhetorical approach, using the thought of Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, which would provide, quote, "a reminder that folklore is not something that a folk does. Rather, it is something that, in its doing, constitutes a folk, as both an immediate audience and a political category. Further, that doing constitutes antagonists or enemies to that folk, a people to kill and a people to kill for. It is a recognition of folklore's central role in the formation of hegemonic and naturalized orders of the world." Next slide. Following this approach, this paper considers the almanacs commercial creations of popular culture, written to both mimic and to satirize the style of backwoods stories, while serving as a form of cultural hegemony that advanced specific political positions. Unlike the historical David Crockett, who preferred collective solidarity to rugged individualism, and whose relations with native peoples were more ambivalent, the fictional Davy of the Almanacs is an unapologetic nativist and terrorizer who advocates for nothing less than the white American domination of North America. Next slide. One of the primary influences for this paper is the New Western History of Patricia Nelson Limerick, who has rejected the Turnerian interpretation in favor of an understanding that Western history is, quote, "the study of a place undergoing conquest and never fully escaping its consequences." This paper is also indebted to scholars who have already employed a rhetorical approach to the almanacs. Doctor of Religious Studies Catherine Albanese has written about the classical and medieval influences on American frontier myths in general and the Crockett almanacs in particular, while Professor of English Laura Langer Cohen has examined the economic circumstances surrounding the publication and distribution of the almanacs and others like them. This paper is in agreement with Cohen's assessment when she has written that, quote, "Crockett provided the almanac's audience of middle-class young men with a fantasy of rebellion against the dominant social order, but one conducted in a humorous idiom safely removed from actual critique. Crockett's outrageous claims at once mark out the backwoods as a world apart and offer it up as a national fantasy. It is the character and function of this national fantasy which forms the primary inquiry of this thesis." Next slide. At first glance, the almanac stories appear irreverent to the point of absurdity, as Davy and his colorful cast of supporting characters regularly make ridiculous boasts or accomplish impossible feats. In an entry from the 1837 almanac, in a speech to Congress, Davy bragged, quote, "I can run faster, dive deeper, stay under longer, and come out drier than any chap this side of Bog Swamp." Davy followed through on his boast too, at one point evading a group of British soldiers by riding his pet alligator up Niagara Falls. While only the first two editions were published in Crockett's lifetime, his ghost became a national hero, still imagined as alive beyond the boundaries of the nation. In an account from the 1841 almanac entitled Latest from the Mines, Davy revealed in a letter that he had survived the Alamo, only to become enslaved in a Mexican gold mine. The almanac's Davy of the 1840s was also an unapologetic nationalist, affirming that, quote, "I am Colonel Davy Crockett, one of the sovereign peoples of Uncle Sam that never kneels to any individual this side of sunshine." In the final editions of the almanac, Davy ascended to the Olympian heights of godhood when the sun had frozen on its axis, forcing the pioneer to give it a great kick, which knocked it loose. In his trajectory from blustering backwoodsman to Promethean hero, the Crockett of the Almanacks became the embodiment of the 19th century spirit of manifest destiny, as the country was transformed from a regional power into the master of North America. Next slide. In addition to tall tales, some of the almanacs also include apparent descriptions of various frontier critters, formatted as apparent scientific entries. In this section on the American lynx from the 1836 almanac, it mentions that from Hudson Bay, about 10,000 skins are annually exported. It makes but little resistance when brought to bay by the hunter. In an entry on the pine marten found later in the same edition, the almanac asserts that, quote, the pine forest in the northern parts of this continent are inhabited by vast numbers of these martens, and that, quote, its fur is highly esteemed whenever obtained. These entries demonstrate how the almanacs perpetuate a mindset that conflates economic interactions with natural behavior and draws from the emerging science on emphasizing the relationship between the visual and the essential. It is not only animals that are subject to scientific categorization, however, for the almanacs also attempt to render as natural elements of race and class. Next slide. Consider this entry on the backwoodsman. Formatted like the other scientific entries, the passage describes him as, quote, a singular being, always moving westward like a buffalo before the tide of civilization. He does not want a neighbor nearer than 10 miles, and when he cannot cut down a tree that will fall within 10 rods of his log house, he thinks it time to sell out his betterment and be off, to squat down in some distant place in the forest. They even like the excitement consequent upon rambling about. By organizing this entry in a scientific style, the almanac was naturalizing an overtly class-based conflict while concealing the economic factors driving it. The message for the urban reader was that backwoods pioneers are not only uncivilized and unsuited to long-term property ownership, but that they prefer it that way. While the almanac portrays Davy as dismissive of the claims of backwoodsmen, the historical Crockett was considered their greatest advocate of the day. In a speech supporting a proposed land bill in 1829, which would have recognized the right of ownership by occupation, he said, quote, nothing makes a people love their government more than acts of parental kindness. Sir, these people, though poor, are of inestimable value in a free republic. Will you take away their little all and give it to the legislature to speculate upon? Or will you make to each of these meritorious citizens the donation of his humble piece of land, where he has at last found refuge from the pursuit of more successful warrant holders? Here particularly lies the hegemonic element of the almanac, as the economic exploitation and dispossession of the backwoodsman is rendered natural or even desirable, while the historical class conflict opposed by Congressman Crockett is completely ignored. This paper also discusses the ways the almanacs try to conceal and naturalize the racial conflicts in 19th century America. I draw upon the groundbreaking work of law professor Cheryl Harris, who has explained the way whiteness came to achieve a status equivalent to property in American law, specifically the right to ownership of the individual themselves. The almanacs participate in this by unequivocally asserting the ownership rights of the Anglo-American characters over the native ones. They furthermore establish a racial hierarchy of appropriation and violence as light-skinned characters exert their will on dark-skinned characters as a matter of course. Next slide. Consider this particular tale from the 1846 almanac, entitled Crockett Mowing Down the Indians for Stealing His Hay, with a 12-foot scythe. After his pet bear alerted Davy to a group of encroaching Indians, he became incensed because, quote, I didn't care about a few cocks o' hay, but the idea of thar comin' and stealin' decent white critters' property rise up my disposition till it boiled and frizzed in me like melted iron in a furnace. In retribution for their trespass, he grabbed his scythe and, quote, then walked among them like 20 corn cutters among corn stalks, and the way I made their heads and legs fly were equal to about 50 swords and 20 cannon in a battlefield, till it wore as red and striped as Uncle Sam's flag. After slaughtering the would-be thieves, Davy and his pet bear, quote, took and piled up their heads and limbs like haycock, and thar let 'em stand as a warning and terrification to all sich savage plunder and trespasses. Such a grisly scene, expressed in comic language and wrapped in moral and patriotic indignation, reverses the historical relations of power in order to conceive of the pioneer and Uncle Sam as the rightful owner of frontier land. It also justifies the brutal reprisals committed against native civilians by the U.S. Army and Andrew Jackson during the Indian Wars, while advancing the Western trope of the native peoples themselves as the aggressors, thereby justifying their forced removal. Next slide. The theme of violence against native peoples finds its most extreme form in a depiction of cannibalism in one of the later Almanac stories from 1849. While traveling the Oregon Trail, Davy encountered two native chiefs, with whom he quickly began to brawl. After emerging victorious from the fight, Davy felt quite famished, but without any food on hand. His solution was to turn the defeated Indians into a stew, a meal which was, in his own words, quote, superlicious. The immediate impression given by the story is one of horror, which also brings to mind reports of historical cannibalism on the frontier, such as the tragic Donner Party. However, Dr. Albanese has analyzed how the frontier was known as a place that evoked barbarous behavior from the inhabitants, which in her analysis made the consumption of the Indian's flesh a type of savage Eucharist, through which Davy takes on the attributes of the savage. This depiction bears witness to the fears and anxieties felt by urban Americans over whether people really did go native in the wilderness, where integration between Anglo-American and native peoples was not uncommon. Bizarre behavior, such as that of the cannibal Crockett, emphasized the difference between different peoples and ways of life in order to horrify the reader into reaffirming their own civilized and racial sensibilities. In this way, the Davy of the Almanacks was an enforcer of cultural barriers who sought to ensure that it was America that consumed the frontier rather than being consumed by it. Finally, with his consumption of the Indian, and by extension his land, the cannibal Davy was affirming the imperial ambitions of the federal government. The American nation desired to feast upon the entire North American continent. Next slide. What would the historical David Crockett have felt about these depictions of his contempt towards and violence against homesteaders and native peoples? In addition to advocating for a land bill to protect the rights of homesteaders, Crockett also bucked political pressure and voted against the Indian Removal Act of 1832. While many historians of Crockett, including James Shackford, have characterized him as a country bumpkin who was used by both parties, I believe a deeper look at his life reveals a true core of conscience which was incompatible with the corrupt Washington of the antebellum period. The Almanacks conceal and distort the details of his life to use Crockett as a hegemonic device to advocate for racial purity, imperial expansion, and ethnic extermination. I hope in some small part I've been able to answer Gencarella's challenge to apply the logic of cultural hegemony to examples of American folklore. The forms of racial discrimination present in the Almanacks, and works like them, are not merely passive reflections of a bygone era, but an active and ongoing assertion of Anglo-American superiority and justification for the domination of North America. When we think about what national heroes like Davy Crockett represent and how we should remember them, what version of history will we choose? Will the nation ingest the lessons of the historical Crockett, or will we be devoured by the fear and anger embodied by the vulgar racist of the Almanacks? Right, yeah.
That's splendid. So, who would like to open the question? David?
Sorry, you're right. Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Oh, okay. So I keep wondering in your narrative, the readership, I think once described by Daniel Borston as young male clerks in counting houses in the Northeast. And were these almanacs sort of their minstrel show that, in a sense, validated their role as young men of power and the whole notion of expansion, maybe not for the glory of an American empire, but just for their sense of self-superiority, the populist sensibility here. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is, and it's kind of a sad subject to bring up, but the way in which racial attitudes of superiority get meshed with a kind of populist sensibility. It's a difficult thing for, I think, historians to talk about because we have general sympathies with people who array themselves against elites and yet don't want to see that kind of sensibility dependent upon notions of racial superiority and so forth. I don't know. To what extent would you pursue this theme of these literary artifacts as directed to a kind of popular sensibility among lower middle class young white men in northeastern cities who are increasingly reconciled to the mercantile order, their fantasies of this kind of heathenism out on the great frontier. Sort of a minstrel show with the very same ambivalence.
Right. Yes, I do think that there is certainly that element, and Borstein has discussed the way that these almanacs seem to embody the idea of like the 19th century American Superman, almost in the sense that as the boundaries of the nation expanded, the imagined identity of the archetypal American also sort of expanded to meet that. And scholars have discussed the way that in these, I think Albanese specifically, in these almanacs, it sort of naturalizes and depicts Crockett and his animal companions doing things or acts that have a direct analogy to like industrial development and capitalist development. For example, my interpretation of like Crockett riding his alligator up Niagara Falls is somewhat a reference to like the Erie Canal. And, the, sort of like an expression of, now Americans really can do this. And it just kind of adds a comedic and naturalizing element to disguise the economic structure. And so, when it comes to the audience, this is why I think cultural hegemony is a useful tool to analyze these almanacs, because we can't really speak from the exact author or whatever, but what we can sort of like myth. They relate to the society that they themselves are appealing to, and when we take the economic measures into account, they are desiring to find a mass audience, which means that the publishers are trying to find out what it is that all of their readers kind of have in common. And so, first of all, they must be literate. They must be connected to the economic systems of distribution, like they have to be able to find these almanacs in their drugstore windows or something. And they are also imagining a kind of national identity that I have detected is exclusionary both towards non-whites and white Europeans of non-American descent. And so through the process of trying to appeal to as broad an American middle-class audience as possible, I detect the formation and the hardening of racial attitudes as a way of otherizing like what is not their readership.
Jennifer, did you have a comment? Are you raising it? No, okay. Alex?
Well, so you mentioned like Superman, and I was wondering, do you see kind of a lineage or a connection between these almanacs and comic books?
Absolutely, yeah. In the same way that like Superman and other, the Avengers, other comic books are all just metaphors for, American imperialism in the Cold War era. Yeah, Davy Crockett is a metaphor for the kind, at least, in this almanac, the kind of expansion that the country was going through in the 19th century. And in my essay, I go into more discussing the connections between the almanacs and like trying to drive up support for the Mexican-American War. And I detect specific entries in these almanacs where it's overtly expansionist and even advocates like the complete annexation of Mexico, for example. Yes, Patricia.
A wonderful presentation, Darren. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to meet, but I just wanted to follow up on David's theme. I just want to clarify. I think that the writers of these almanacs are in Boston. That's why those Boston, and they're aimed at those Boston clerks. And in fact, mocks the white populist. I just want my little piece of land. And mocks that in favor of the corporate order, in favor of states taking that land away from the little guy and being rational. And guess what? We like the links, we like the honor, we like this, and we're going to grab. So I think it's past rescuing the yeoman farmer, the white yeoman farmer. It's endorsed the corporate order, because those people are also bound for extinction.
Right.
In their crazy ways, and that don't get a in a sense, don't win and don't get a hearing. So is that your take on it? I think that's where you're pointing at.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I even would, because some of the scholars have described these as having like Whiggish attributes or other, that they could sort of be like a defense of Jacksonianism in some circuitous way, but I actually feel like they weren't intended to be overtly political, even while advancing certain political positions. And it's that, yeah, they were intended to more be the reflections of, right, the view of the upper, or the eastern seaboard urban readership, and yes, the corporate class, absolutely.
Right, so if poor whites and poor landowners in general have a tiny little claim to the emerging capitalist order, it's so small that it can't compete. It's seen as quaint at best and expendable.
Absolutely, yes.
So it's sort of like Henea's claim on tenuous freedom for free blacks. It's tenuous freedom for free whites on some level. I don't want to equalize those, but
right.
Economically marginal folks, not so much.
Right.
So anyway, I've said too much. These are wonderful papers and they're very interesting.
Yeah, well, one of the things you do point out, and one of the things that really struck me about the historical period that the almanacs are operating in, is that the official categorization of property, or the official understanding of property, was still very much in its nascent form. I mean, obviously we're dealing with the problem of, what is the legal status of slaves and whatnot, but when it comes to frontier land, I mean, you're dealing with mineral rights, resource rights, timber rights, water rights, and, it just creates so many kind of convoluted levels of assertions of ownership that at a certain, it kind of makes ownership entirely almost like socially conditioned on, the circumstances that it's claimed and so forth.
Well put, and Alex and I had a number of conversations. What is a body?
Yeah.
What is a body? It's more difficult than you think. It's a construct. So I have to head out after John, but wonderful job. Tom, thank you for putting this in. Congratulations to all the students. Adios.
Thank you.
I have one quick comment, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'll throw it in there. You're talking about how the image of Davy Crockett riding the alligator could have been the metaphor for the further expansion and development of Erie Canal, and I think it's fascinating that the head of that, or the treasurer, and for a while the head of the company that was pushing and made the canal, was the person who financed and pushed for the first New York penitentiary, Newgate.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were very, I think, interconnected both economically and politically. So
right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Is it's not something I go into or had time to go into this thesis, but yeah, the connection between the northern corporate interests and kind of the southern slave owning order is much more closely interlinked than a lot of conventional historical interpretations would hold.
Mm-hmm.